Okay. All right, everybody, welcome. It's a real privilege to have Professor Doyne Farmer here. And before I sort of introduce you to him, I want to show you something I just saw the other day. Let me see if I can pull this off. I'm going to share my screen, put this on, share it, and see what it is. Okay, so this is a um, a Substack essay written by a young man named Alex Sema. I think he is an undergraduate or just graduate or something like that. And what he did was he wanted to see, looking at the way different software companies like Apple, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, how they organized their software development. And he sort of set them up based on what his understanding was of how they did software development. He then organized a group of AI agents. He set up these large language models that do computer programming, software development, and had these agents solve problems um, within these different organization structures. And the and then came up with the results of sort of which ones worked better or not. Anyway, so the guy's name is Alex Sema, Sima. And I'll probably post on this at some point in my Substack, but meanwhile you can look him up. My point being that this, in my mind, could be a big element of the future of economics. And I'm going to later ask Professor Farmer to comment on that and sort of how it kind of relates to his history and his work, because in some sense, I think the advent of these large language models has reduced the cost of doing economics the way Professor Farmer would want to do it, has reduced that cost tremendously. And people, I think, are going to figure that out and start doing economics that way a lot more. It would be my prediction. And this may be an early example of that, Sema's essay. But anyway, instead of, we'll get to the future at some point, but what I'm going to do in the meantime is go back in the past. And I have this memory when I was in grad school or shortly afterward. I was in grad school in the late 1970s, and some of my classmates circulated a story that was too good to check. And the story was that there had been a meeting in between that brought together a group of economists and a group of physicists. And the economists went there hoping that they were going to learn better mathematical techniques and they were going to apply math more in their work. And the joke was on them. Again, this is a story that's probably too good to check, that the physicists thought that the economists' math was too abstract and too extreme. And so they ended up not appreciating that. So over the years, I've sort of thought of that as a too good to check story, an apocryphal story. And then I read Farmer's book and I'm thinking, were you at that meeting? And can you tell us about it?
Sure. Yeah, I was at that meeting. It made quite an impression on me. And I think the version you said is sort of right, but not quite right, because the physicists shrug their shoulders at the economist math. I mean, it's just math. Physicists are pretty good at that. But the thing that struck us was actually how they they were proving theorems about things that we didn't think that was appropriate. And what we really didn't like were the assumptions that the science was based on, and in particular, rational expectations. So this was in 1987.
Okay.
And back then, rational expectations was still riding very strong in economics. And we just uniformly expressed skepticism about that idea. And also felt that, economists should be making more use of computers and simulation and other tools that were lying by the side. So I think the economists were disappointed, um, uh, with one or two exceptions.
But that became a career-changing move for you, right? You came in there from the physics side of things, right?
That's right. What happened was Ken Arrow recruited a group of 10 economists and for his team, and um, Phil Anderson, who, if you don't know anything about physics, he has at least the same stature as Ken Arrow in physics, as Ken Arrow does in economics. And so there were 10 on the physics team, and I was on the physics team. And it didn't immediately have an impact on me because at the time I was just kind of doing it out of general interest, but it long term had a big impact because as I molded over, I realized that once you're a more mature scientist, you realize the best fields to do research in are the fields that have major problems or where not a lot is known, so the low-hanging fruit can still be picked. And so I've been doing that now for the last 25 years or so.
Okay. Um, so then sort of, well, first of all, so you spent some time doing physics that, and I assume you got a PhD and did that whole bit.
I
Um,
did.
and did you sort of gradually shift careers, or is there a point where you can say, well, now I know I'm not in physics anymore. I'm not in Kansas anymore.
Well, yeah, though it happened in a way that makes that a little, there's no exact point, but I went from doing cosmology as a graduate student, uh, thinking about galaxy formation, and to then I discovered what's now called chaos theory. And that's what I actually wrote my dissertation on, together with three other graduate students who we self-advised each other. Then I went to Los Alamos for 10 years, did more chaos theory, began doing what's now called complex systems. But because I had this experience beating roulette, I focused a lot on prediction. So I wrote papers about prediction, and that then, I don't know, we were predicting lots of things using time series, sunspots, ice ages, fluid flows. And somebody, when I would present my work, would always say, have you tried applying this to the stock market? And I got tired of saying no. And so left Los Alamos and started Prediction Company, which I was with for 8 years. So there we were really focusing on prediction of the stock market and we were one of the first quant trading firms using a completely automated strategy. But then I began reading the financial economics literature in earnest. And when I got through at Prediction Company, because I never wanted to be a trader for my whole life, uh, I decided to apply complex systems ideas to economics. And that was the point where that switch really began in earnest.
And what year
And
is that approximately?
that would be 1999.
Okay.
Actually, while I was with Prediction Company, I wrote a paper on the side on market ecology that was released in 1998. And so I've been doing first finance and now increasingly macro and technological change and economic growth. So I'm now working in those areas.
Okay. Market ecology, of course, that's a fascinating title. You want to discuss that at all?
Sure. Um, it was based on my observation. I got very frustrated with all the finance papers I would read that would begin by assuming an agent with perfect information and perfect calculational abilities. And so
Sorry, that when you mentioned rational expectations for the audience, that's a part of that, this sort
yeah,
of
yeah,
uh,
that's a
there's
central
only
part of
one
it.
model of the world and everyone knows that model and there's
Yeah.
no reason to disagree. Okay,
And
go ahead.
in many
Sorry.
finance papers, the starting assumption is that at least some group of people know the correct valuation of stocks, which, having worked in the field for 8 years, just seemed ludicrous to me. And but instead, I noticed from my wanderings around Wall Street that each firm had its own culture. People have very clear ideas about their strategies they followed. They're very specialized. They're value investors, momentum traders, growth funds, index arb. We were stat arb, market makers. Very People who participate in financial markets typically do very specialized roles. And and so because that's what ecology is essentially about. And ecology, you know, um, well, as I say in the book, grass is a specialist at turning sunlight and earth and water into grass. Zebras are specialists at eating grass and turning it into zebras, and lions are specialists at eating zebras and turning them into lions. But but you might think, oh, well, lions and grass aren't interacting directly because lions don't eat grass. But actually, if you disturb the lion population because it affects the zebra population, it has a big effect on the grass. And and similarly, I think to understand financial markets, you need to think about what are the strategies, how many people are, or how much money is behind each strategy, and how do those strategies interact? Because all those strategies are affecting prices. And the ecology is always changing over time, or I should really say the ecosystem is always evolving. And which is, I think, what you need to understand if you want to understand why markets fail and why strategies that work well in one period don't work well in other periods. And if you want to understand what kind of strategies have the potential to really mess up the market, I think if we'd been using these ideas in a more quantitative way, or at least if the regulators had, we could have anticipated the effect that mortgage-backed securities would have on the global economy. So
Yeah,
anyway,
well,
that's the basic idea. I can answer more questions.
no, that was very good. And can you say that in some sense your subsequent career was sort of a follow-up on that paper? It sort of,
Well, the paper certainly got me started um, uh, thinking about first financial markets and then the economy in general. And so not all my work in economics revolves around that paper, but it sort of kind of set the tone of my work, I think.
is like, I mean, compared to standard economics, it immediately brings up sort of the possibility of trying to do agent-based modeling, simulations, and even chaos theory, even introducing that, right?
Yes, and I'm not the first person to do agent-based modeling in economics, um, but I think it's a valuable tool that we're going to use more and more, and we'll have more and more successful applications. We're in a phase where, and maybe I should just explain what that means. An agent-based model is really a simulation of the economy where you call them agent-based models rather than simulations because the key challenge is always to model the decision-making of the agents in a reasonable way. And um, early attempts to do this were very qualitative, but we're moving into a new phase where agent-based models are becoming quantitative, being used as time series models, being tested in a quantitative way, and making quantitative predictions about the future or about how policies will affect things.
Yeah, and it's not like this kind of modeling gives you a point estimate of the future necessarily. It kind of doesn't it give you more of a set of possible scenarios depending on kind of some initial conditions or things like that?
Well, these models always depend on randomness. And that is, you always have to input some random numbers to deal with the fact that there's risk involved and that there's uncertainty. And so you can generate ensembles of futures corresponding to the set of possibilities as far as your model can pin them down. So, which we view as a good thing because it means the predictions are probabilistic rather than point predictions. And and then we have to think about testing the models based on our the probabilities that we predict, the probabilities that we actually observe.
So that's very different than sort of, especially textbook like macroeconomics, where there's a set of equations, there's one equilibrium, there's one solution, and sometimes, at least in sort of the textbook versions of it doesn't even depend on the past. Whereas I assume that, there's a lot of path dependency in your work. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's true. You know, if you start looking at research papers in macroeconomics, say dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, they also produce probabilistic predictions um, because they feed in an ensemble of different shocks to see what they think might happen. Um, so we're both doing that. We think we can achieve a state where we make better predictions. That is, the probabilities are narrower and and the predictions are more reliable.
Okay. Um, okay, so what would be um so where say more about sort of the difference between sort of mainstream macro and the type of macro you would be doing.
Yeah. So in a mainstream model, and they all follow this template, and let me also be clear, I'm not talking about econometric models, which are statistical models, essentially. You have a bunch of data and you fit a function to the data. Typically, you do a linear regression.
Yeah,
But
that's got all sorts of different problems that in some ways are worse. Yeah,
yeah,
too.
and we can come back and talk about that if we come back to the AI theme that you mentioned at the beginning. But in an agent-based model, you put in whatever you know about market structure and the actual economics of the problem. You um, populate well, actually, sorry. Let me go back and say how mainstream models work. So mainstream models work like this. You assign each agent a utility function. You write down you also assign them beliefs about the world in the standard version, still from the workhorse models they use at the Fed and Treasury departments and so forth. They assume rational expectations, meaning the agents can make the calculations they need to calculate to maximize their utility. You make some assumptions about who has what information, and then you deduce the decisions that the agents will make in order to maximize their individual utilities, given that the agents are also thinking about all the other agents and deduce what they're going to do to maximize their utility. So you end up with a solution, and then you know, you solve these equations, and that's how those models work. Ours work very differently because, as I said, you ask the question, how do we think these agents really make their decisions? So you look at behavioral economics, or in many cases, it can be kind of obvious. You know, if a financial agent is predicting volatility, they're going to use a moving average of past volatility because that's what people do. If they're a value investor, they're going to buy undervalued assets and sell overvalued assets. You may have to think a bit about how you get the valuations. But anyway, you then put this in a simulation where the agents take the information they have at the time, they make decisions using their rules. Those decisions have economic impact. The economic impact generates new information, and maybe some information flows in from outside. And then the agents make another set of decisions, and you just go around and around that loop. And so it's
So
inherently
there's a
dynamical.
macroeconomic ecology that's kind of analogous to the financial market ecology that you set out in that previous one.
That's exactly right. Um, or if the model were a financial model, it would be directly a market ecology model. I have a couple of students who've been working on that, making realistic models of that type. But
That
so
must be
it's,
hard. I'm just going to joke a little bit. I mean, there's things like what happened with GameStop.
yeah,
Try to put that into a model
yeah.
somehow.
No, well, actually, I have a couple of students, other students who have an explicit model for GameStop. They took advantage of the fact that there's a quite rich record of all of the online interactions the people who made GameStop happen had. And they've studied it to see how people heard, what was it that caused their opinions to change, and so forth. But we're actually working at a little bit of a different level. We're looking at the um, uh, the filings, the regulatory filings that agents need to make in order, or I should say agents, mutual funds have to make uh, to satisfy the SEC. Every quarter, the SEC requires mutual funds to give a snapshot of their holdings. And so there's now a 20-year record of that for essentially all mutual funds. So we can actually see what mutual funds did quarter by quarter and
So you can sort of
mimic those.
reverse engineer their strategies in
Yeah,
some
at some
sense.
weak level. I mean,
Yeah,
we're not trying to beat the market with this.
right.
We're just trying to have a simulation about how the market behaves and how the market ecosystem affects volatility and so on. And answer questions like, suppose the trend towards index funds keeps going so that index funds start to take over. At what point does the system break? Because we're not processing enough information and index funds are creating excess volatility. So we can study questions like that with that kind of model. But hopefully I at least have given you a flavor of how these models work differently from the mainstream models.
And then when you turn, and then going back, you turn these loose in macroeconomics, you actually have the agents are no longer just sort of Wall Street investors. Now they're firms, they're, I guess, groups of individual consumers, different categories of consumers, things like that.
Households,
Yeah.
yep. And in these models, we create a synthetic population of households. So we take a careful look at the census data for each country, and we build a synthetic population that isn't real individuals, but we can have millions of people or
Yeah.
millions of individuals in our synthetic population with millions of households. And we try and get the demography right, so to match age, income, education level, even race and gender. And uh, and then we simulate both their labor behavior, because many of them have jobs and work for firms, and their consumption behavior. So we get that Keynesian feedback loop between production and uh, consumption and labor that's such an important part of what the macroeconomy does.
And on something like that, how do you get sort of the ongoing churn? Because, in the United States, the aggregate employment rate will change at the rate of, let's say 250,000 jobs a month, but that's net. The gross figures are over 4 million a month. So
Yep.
there's this tremendous churn. How do you handle that and innovation and things like that?
Well, we allow people to get new jobs at roughly that rate. And uh, so we try and capture that because, of course, that's important when we start going into recession. You have things like the beverage cycle that say that it's easier to go into the recession than it is to come out of it. And it's important to get the occupational labor dynamics right. In fact, we have a separate model that's just a model of occupational labor that was designed by my ex-student Maria Del Rio Chanona. And in that model, the agents are workers. The workers have an occupation. The workers are, we're trying to accurately mimic the process you just mentioned. So the workers they quit their jobs with a certain frequency, they apply for new jobs. But when they apply for new jobs, they can apply for new jobs in a different occupation, or at least the occupations that their skills allow them to transition into. So we have very rich data sets on this that we can calibrate our models against. And the purpose is to understand what's going to happen in transitions like the green energy transition, where we fire fossil fuel workers and hire solar farm workers. Or we've also written a paper on automation to try and figure out how the sort of ecosystem of occupational labor will change over time.
So the question that everyone's asking nowadays is, what the new AIs are going to do to the job structure. How do you feel about trying to answer that with your models?
Well, we have a paper on that. We took studies that had been done by some other people about which occupations would be affected, and then we imposed an AI shock, and then the simulation allows you to watch how people change occupations as a result of the shock. Because when you remove some jobs, when some occupations get hit, then people start transitioning into the occupations they can move into. And so it really allowed us to study the whole ecosystem. And we could see that, there was some surprising results. For example, childcare workers aren't directly affected by AI, but because it's a job many, many other occupations can transition into, they actually take a hit because it becomes a much more competitive profession. Um, uh, so yeah, we can actually just kind of track how the whole network of occupational labor morphs over time as a result of these kind of shocks. We haven't gone back and redone that paper. Paper was written pre-Chat GPT. I suspect Chat GPT has already changed the predictions about which occupations are going to be affected, but we will probably redo that at some point.
Okay. Um, all right. Are there some other sort of findings from that research that you want to highlight for us?
Well, I think that's an example of the kind of non-equilibrium models that we build. I mean that in the sense that I think one of the advantages of this approach is it's better suited for dealing with situations where there's rapid change. One of our biggest successes so far was in modeling the COVID pandemic, where the economy got hit with a very sharp shock and a very fast shock. And we were able to very successfully model how different industries evolved over the course of the COVID shock and the economic hit to the economy. And we were able to do that under different scenarios about lockdowns and so forth. But at least for the UK and the scenario that was picked, we made very accurate predictions about what subsequently happened.
Okay. And let me go back to that thing that I flashed on at the very beginning. This sort of very young kid doing a very intricate analysis using, I think, agent-based modeling, using these AIs as agents. What do you think about that? Or does my intuition is that that brings the cost of your style of modeling just way down? Is that do you see that
It,
coming?
it definitely it's definitely very useful and very handy for some things. Of course, it's immediately handy because ChatGPT has sped up programming because you can write mundane little aspects of what you have to do, ChatGPT can just write the code for you. It's useful. Another place where we've used it, it was, say, we wanted to know which firms were using which patents. You can look up which firms own which patents, but that's very different than the firms that use them. And programs like ChatGPT are very useful at reading patents and looking at information about firms and then matching them up. And now another use that we're playing with now is to actually train agents that actually think like human beings. We want the agents to be the right amount smart, not too dumb, not too smart. And so some of my postdocs are actually working on that problem. Now, but AI and or ChatGPT and AI in general are not a panacea for economics because they work great when you have lots and lots of data. Or AI more generally works great when that happens, and large language models work well when that data is text. But there are a lot of problems in economics, most problems, where you're data poor. We don't have that extensive, even since World War II, there have been maybe 10 or 12 business cycles. We don't really have that much data about what the economy does because it changes relatively slowly, which means you have to use models where you can impose priors about the structure of the world, which then allow you to do things with less data. And so for us, and let me say one other thing, you need models where you can do counterfactuals. That is, you can say, suppose we change this policy, how will that change the economy? Models like, well, AI models are typically assume the world will stay as it is. And if the behavior fundamentally changes, they can't really cope with that. So, whereas agent-based models, at least done right, can do that. So the key punchline is it gives us a way to build models that are more parsimonious and therefore work better when presented with new things than AI. So AI is definitely a change, something that's changing the game, but I don't think it's yet changed the game fundamentally for the kinds of problems that we're working on.
Really? So, I mean, I just think in terms of doing the setup of the agents, I mean, maybe you covered this when you said it's just so easy to code, but it's like, you know, trying to, I just imagine trying to code up agents being really hard, whereas I just say, well, just tell this large language model, these are your heuristics, that's you,
Yeah,
that's you. And you just do that for, 1,000, 5,000 different people or whatever. It just sounds to me like a really low
I
cost way of doing it.
I think in the long term, it may prove to be exceedingly useful. Again, because we can look at how real world people think and capture heterogeneity. We can tell ChatGPT, here's a lot of records of central bank transcripts. Try and think like a central banker. Um, and so I do think it's going to be useful as we hone these models to get the way real people think right.
Okay,
So I completely agree with you there. It's not the programming per se that's hard. It's getting the right set of rules for each of the
okay.
agents.
And the earlier in the conversation, you said something about um, you talked about the problems of multiple regression, and I think you said that some of these problems will show up in these AIs.
Well,
Did I hear that right? And
yeah, let me clarify. So what I was just saying is conceptually, they're really very similar ways of doing things. Machine learning, how does it work? You take a functional form called, an artificial neural net, and you fit that function to the data. In the case of large language models, they fit it to a gazillion different texts and have, you know, literally millions of free parameters to fit the data,
Yeah.
fit that model to the text, but it's still just fitting a function to data. Now, in econometrics, they do the same thing, except the models are typically just linear functions. So the function they use is much simpler.
And they have
Now,
just way less data, like as you
they
pointed
typically have
out.
way less data, though people like Raj Chetty and others are now doing studies where they're looking at massive data sets. And there you see people in econometrics beginning to use machine learning methods to make inferences because they have enough data that they can have enough free parameters to actually fit nonlinear functions.
Okay. All right. I want to sort of give the people who came here a chance to ask questions if they want to. Um, so I mean, I certainly could ask more myself, but if somebody either wants to raise an actual hand or a virtual hand, feel free if you have some questions. Um, so I guess before I do that, I'll ask more. So if you could sort of say where this sort of ecological modeling, chaos theory, your form of heterodox economics is going, where will it be, let's say, in 5 years? What will you have done?
Well, I have a fairly optimistic prediction. I've started a company called Macrocosm, whose purpose is to scale these methods up and reduce them to practice. I think we're beginning to have some success with practical applications. And I hope 5 years from now to see more adoption by central banks. There's already significant adoption. I'd say there's 8 or 10 central banks that have housing market models based on things we've done that are agent-based models, and 2 central banks that are now using agent-based macro models. And I think we'll just see that proliferate, and we'll see more applications in a variety of different domains.
And how will you communicate that stuff back to um, mainstream economists? Because mainstream economics does have the virtue of it's sort of automatically transparent what's going on, uh, and the agent-based models don't. So how are you going to handle that communication?
Well, when we build agent-based models, we actually spend almost as much work trying to put all the diagnostic indicators we need so we can see what the model is doing and why it's doing it. And that is making sure that the model is not a black box and that its behavior is comprehensible. But that does require a lot of focus to make happen.
Can you maybe illustrate what a diagnostic
Well, think of it
tool?
like a stethoscope. You know, I can't see my heart, but I can put a stethoscope on it and listen to it. And I could listen in different parts of my chest. And and so we basically put in little monitors, and we spend a lot of work building visual displays. So, we see a peculiar behavior. We go, well, what's causing that? Is that, and we could go, oh, I see. It's because these households over here, their consumption behavior really changed, or these firms really are doing something different than they did before. Um, or we do tests to show that, oh, this really depends heavily on interest rates, and really characterize what's happening, whose behavior changes as interest rates change, and so forth. Because at the end of the day, to convince anybody to use these kind of models, you have to be able to tell a story about why the model's doing what it's doing. And it's
Okay,
not a trivial thing to do. It's part of the craft is to do that well.
okay. All right, so somebody has their virtual hand up. They're going under the title of Zoom user. You want to unmute yourself and ask your question, make your comment, whatever. Zoom user. Let me see if I can ask to unmute. Is that
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, that
Yes.
sounds like Tom.
Yeah, I'm on my phone instead of on my computer because
Okay.
my house is being remodeled. I had a comment and then a couple of questions, but the comment is recently there's been a huge upsurge in the type of game called a worker allocation game, where you have a couple of workers and you allocate getting resources, including getting additional workers or not. And um, as you're talking about agents, that's sort of very different than, let's say, Risk or Monopoly, where it's, take over the world or get all the money. And I think there's going to be a lot more issues about agents in games. So I, that was a comment that I'd like you to respond to after my question, which is concerning your prediction company, where you left it in '99, a couple of years after Greenspan's irrational exuberance talk in, I think that was Christmas '96, but it was just before the dot-com bubble pop. And I'm wondering if your company predicted or that prediction companies were predicting the dot-com bubble pop in a way that allowed you to do multiple little shorts to make a lot of money.
Yeah. So let me take the last question first. We were what's called a statar fund. So we were market neutral and industry neutral and interest rate neutral. And then we took all the risk factors and hedged them all out. So we were betting on the idiosyncratic moves, if you will, the little ripples that individual stocks make around the group. So we weren't even trying to predict something like the dot-com bubble. And in fact, we rode through it without hardly noticing it because we were just betting on differences effectively between companies. So while we weren't exactly doing pairs trading, if we were long on Apple, we'd be short on Dell or something like that. So no, we didn't predict that, though subjectively, I was very aware of it. In fact, I made the foolish mistake of selling half my stocks in 1998 because I thought there was a bubble and it was going to pop, and it went up by another 100% before it did. I managed to sell the rest at a pretty decent price, but that's just my personal portfolio. Now, on your first question, the these games, it's true that actually there's a lot of interesting data coming out of games now because there's virtual worlds. And so I'm actually having a conversation in a few days with somebody who's studying one of these games where they have technologies and looking at technology adoption in those games. And our hypothesis, well, our curiosity is to see whether it looks like real technology adoption. There's also, you mentioned a worker game where there's some very nice work by Rob Axtell and his collaborators on how workers enter and leave firms and how firms grow, again, in an agent-based model that explains a lot of facts about firm growth and also about occupational labor diffusion. And those are actually separate papers, but they have some things in common. So anyway, I don't know if I've answered your questions, but thank you for the questions.
Okay, thank you.
And I think, Ernie, did you have a question
Yeah,
you would ask?
yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, first, I really enjoyed your book, and thank you for coming and spending some time with us. I have one question after thinking about it. I really don't have any answers for this, but your networks have nodes in them, both households and firms. And I think you treat the government exogenously in all your models. And I'm just wondering if you've thought about making the government an endogenous node in the model so that the government's react to events as well?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. There is a little bit of the government making the government endogenous that we follow a standard economist in frequently using a Taylor rule to anticipate what central bank's going to do. So that would be an example. But but the basic answer is no. And why? Just because I view that as harder, right? I think my approach is solve the easy problems first. And while it's already plenty hard, understanding what the firms and households are going to do in response to a government policy is easier than anticipating what kind of policies the government might adopt in the future. That, of course, depends on politics and sociology and lots of other stuff. But it's down the road. I would love to be able to do what you said. It's just, we're not quite there yet.
And one of the things that happens in governments is they start programs that go on forever and never end. And so when you start, and the reason I'm interested in that is that once you start a policy, how do you know when to stop it?
Yeah. Well, again, that's above beyond what we can do now. You know, you can at least investigate how those policies will work in different situations. And of course, policy that works well in one kind of world may work very poorly in another. And, you know, but again, that's sort of down the road. Understanding the long-term evolution of the economy is something we'd love to do better. Right now, we're more interested in, say, business cycle frequencies, just partly because that's more tractable. There's more data to test, better understood. But I'd love to do the things you mentioned down the line.
Okay, does anyone else have a question, comment, or whatever? Okay, so where should people go to find out more about your work and your history and so on? Obviously, there's there's the book. Where else?
Well, the book has a big bibliography. I mean, I think my publishers would have preferred it was smaller. So there's a lot of hooks in there. If you want to take any topic and just start looking at the endnotes, I really tried to provide a lot of sources for further study. And I mean, we're about actually, there's going to be a Santa Fe Institute proceedings. It's the 4th volume that's starting with the 87 meeting that you mentioned. So at that 87 meeting, there was a proceedings volume called The Economy is an Evolving Complex System. Then there's been a part 2 and a part 3, and we're now going to do part 4, 40 years later almost. And
Wait, what's that going to be about? Sort of, or who's going to put that together, and what's that going to be about?
Santa Fe Institute will be publishing it, and it will be appearing probably in December.
So, I mean, but who are the people who are contributing to it?
Oh, the contributors are, well, many of them are my former graduate students and postdocs and other leaders. We've really tried to bring in all the people we view as leaders in the field. And we're also trying to span all the different topics that have been worked on, from finance to macro to technological change. So we've really tried to, and even in industrial policy and developmental growth. So we tried to really provide a good sampling of that. And so there will be maybe even a 2-volume proceedings book that I think would be a good source. It's not going to be highly technical papers. It's more papers about the big picture, reviews, and perspective pieces.
I see we have another question. Ben, do you want to unmute?
Yeah, so it sort of builds on a couple of things that have been said. Right now, industrial policy is very popular in DC. And, you know, for many reasons, we may think that that's foolish, but it is what it is. In particular, with regards to the defense industry, there's a lot of discussion about industrial security and various interventions like CFIUS to prevent foreign acquisition of firms. And I just wondered if you had tread into any areas that touch that very relevant topic. Thank you.
Well, I wish we had had time and resources to get there, but I have to say we really haven't tackled that one yet. I think it would be a really interesting thing to do. And, once we lay some more foundations, something we could contribute to, we're still at the stage where we're trying to get we're basically doing head-to-head tests of our macro models against standard mainstream models. And they're doing a much more generic kind of thing. But as we build out the details, we would love to address that question because, industrial policy, I mean, there's pros and cons, and it's going to be tricky to get it right. I think it's a case where having good modeling is probably going to be essential to getting it right. But I wish I could give a better answer to your question.
Yeah, I guess that's where the modeling would have to also deal with Ernie's issue of sort of how the government is a behavioral actor, not merely sort
Yeah.
of an exogenous thing.
Yeah,
Okay.
we've been thinking about modeling the IRA, and already in the IRA, you have to really think about
That's
the
the
agency.
Inflation Reduction Act.
Yeah, the
That's what it's
Inflation
called.
Reduction Act, which is really the let's promote new sources of energy act. But the act's had some surprising consequences, has a bigger effect than people thought, and we'd love to understand in a more textured way what it's really going to do, but we're just not quite there yet.
Yeah, if I may, as an ecologist, I find it fascinating that you're trying to fix economics by building on ecology. I was back 20 years ago talking to the head of the NSF about setting up a summer class for ecologists to learn from econometrics how to do mathematical modeling, because it seemed like the ecologists didn't really know much. And so this feels a little bit perverse. It's also a little bit grating to hear speak of the ecology evolving and so on, because we're so used to dividing things up firmly into the ecological, the evolutionary, and the developmental timescales, and the behavioral, of course. And so as you think about the relative timescales of the entities like governments and their actions, not being under selection pressure so much relative to individual firms, say, I start to think about eco, evo, and devo, but that's probably not the vocabulary you would choose over.
Well, I mean, interesting set of ideas. My original stimulus was just thinking about financial markets, where I think the evolution can take place on a time scale of a few years. As new financial instruments get introduced, some trading strategies get more popular. Just look at the evolution of index funds over the last 20 years. And in a way, we're not trying to predict the evolution so much as what happens when the ecosystem changes. If you have more trend followers, we can show that markets get less stable, and you're much more likely to have bubbles. And so that's the kind of thing that we can understand via these sorts of models. You have a bit of a hint about the evolution because you can see who makes profits under what circumstances. Because if you take one of our models and you start playing with it, and you start playing around with the populations, which we can just change by hand, populations here meaning how much money is invested in each strategy, then you just see that who makes money depends on how big everybody else is, because there are predator-prey relationships, there are competitive relationships, and even mutualistic relationships. And so I think our models have allowed us to get a richer understanding of that. But you know, always the further out you go in the future and the more you try and make endogenous, the harder the problem gets and the more nervous you have to be that you're walking off into a space where you can't stay firmly grounded in data anymore,
Yeah.
which is
Well,
where I like to be.
yeah, it does, yeah, it really sounds wild. I mean, and I just think of, uh, you know, you know, I don't know when you would have thought about it, but 5 years ago, I would have never thought of the concept of an influencer, a social media influencer, being a factor in the financial market. And that comes from nowhere, and you can't.
Things evolve quickly.
Yeah. So that is a sense in which the timescales you're working on are much faster than what you think of as evolutionary
Yeah. What we
time.
can do right now are kind of what if experiments of the form. What if we introduce a strategy like this? What if we introduce a new kind of financial instrument so we can model that kind of thing and see what what are the unanticipated side effects, and that's more the goal of what we're trying to do now.
Mhm. Sorry, I keep coming up with more questions, but here's another one. Anything you would say about Bitcoin in light of all this, of sort of, could you advise regulators about how to deal with Bitcoin?
Well, I'm afraid you guys are asking questions I can't answer.
Yeah,
I mean, I've stayed clear of Bitcoin. I never liked chain letters, and Bitcoin's a big electronic chain letter. But on the other hand, obviously people who are savvy about it have made huge amounts of money. So
yeah. No,
and
I'm the same. I'm going to say I'm about the same generation you are, and I have the exact same view of it as an electronic chain letter. But maybe we need to model chain letters now. I don't
yeah,
know.
well, they are modelable. So
Yeah.
I would love to do that. I only wish I had 10 lives so I could address all the
Mm.
questions you guys keep bringing up.
Yeah. Well, my sense again is that you know with machine learning, there are going to be a lot more people use the bad pun of toiling in the fields that Mr. Farmer has been toiling in. I think there will be a lot more. Oh, Tom, do you want to throw one more at us?
Yeah, you were talking. Yes, please. And thank you for a great talk. I'm really enjoying this. You were talking about validating the models, and it occurred to me that one of my critiques of most climate models is that they don't take all the data that's available up to some year, let's say 2001 or 2007. I don't remember when Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth came out, and say, well, based on this information, this is how we model the next 5 or 10 years. And when you do a stop of information up to, let's say, 2010, you should be able to model, according to your model and that information, the years 2011 to 2015, and then compare it to the reality. I mean, that's what I was thinking. And I'm wondering how you do that kind of thing.
Well, we do it just the way you say it. We call that a back test. And, from my time running prediction company, back tests were the central thing we did to test our models. And so we do that. We devote a lot of energy to doing just that. We do it with our macro model, and that's how we're testing against the mainstream models. We do it with our technology forecasting models that we haven't discussed here. But yeah, that's the mainstay. And you have to be very careful, of course, because if you backtest too many times, then you're not really backtesting anymore because you've sniffed what the future is going to do. So we also go to great pains to avoid that. We often divide our data into three pieces. There's the training set, the test set, and the final validation set. And you really don't use that validation set. You try to just use it once. And then, of course, one of the reasons I'm starting this company, Macrocosm, is because I want to start developing a real-time track record, because that's something that's more trustable, because you can't fake it. And I've made some good predictions so far, but we want to start routinely publishing our predictions, making predictions about lots of things, and making the track record public and transparent.
That would be really a first, not the transparency, but any success in macroeconomic forecasting would be an absolute first. You're really going in where, you know, the record is just an incredible record of failure. So you're really taking a big risk.
Well, I prefer, the bar is set low, and that helps. But we are not, we're not going to have accurate point forecasts, but we just hope to show that statistically speaking, we can do better than what has been done.
Okay. Well, on that note, I'd like to thank you very much. I think people really enjoyed this, and I think people really enjoy it when we put it up on YouTube. So
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Okay, goodbye.
Bye-bye.